Hello, Remy. Welcome to our Reef podcast from Broward College. You are our first guest in this experience that we are developing for our students, together with our Reef tanks, in which we are training students in reef husbandry, both with the goal of gaining more knowledge about the marine environment, becoming graduate students, or working in the industry, which is needed for qualified workers. So with us today, we have two interns, Garcy and Ryan, that have been doing their internship during the entire summer, learning how to maintain properly quarantine and clean the systems and watch over water parameters. And we also have an alumni, Giulliana, which is newer to the hobby, but she's gaining more experience as he's being trained in our college. So I will let you guys start with your discussion about what are those things that attract you from the what we call the hobby in general, or reefing, maintaining corals, with Remy, which is this level. I wouldn't say a legend because he's gonna say no, but it's certainly someone that is very recognizable and well known inside the hobby, that is doing a great job with reef builders as of lately. So I'll let you start.
Well, first of all, thank you, Remy, for meeting with us. We're so honored to have you here. Um, I wanted to ask you, you as a coral reef keeper, what would be the most important thing to consider, or what aspects would you consider, especially for people like me that are new to the hobby, to reef tank keeping?
Yeah, well, thank you guys for having me. It's always fun to talk about this kind of stuff with people. So, I think if I was going to answer that question, I would definitely say, do you have the time to do it, to take care of these animals? Because I think that that's one thing that people overlook, is that they see coral and they're like, oh, these plants are awesome. They're not plants, they're animals. They're colonial animals that need to be taken care of, and need proper water chemistry and parameters to thrive and survive. So do you have the time to do that? Do you have the resources to do that? I will say that you can do this on a budget if you need to, but having I would say mapping out the financial part of this is probably a good idea to do up front, to see how much you would actually need to make sure that these animals can thrive in their habitat. But I would say that that's probably two things that I would definitely consider before getting into the hobby, for sure.
Yeah, that's I think it's very important for sure. And about the connection that we have with the corals, for example, because like as you said, they're animals too. I think everybody, like in general, we try to connect to other beings, either they're plants or they're animals, or the nature around us. So there is also like a sort of enthusiasm to keep something alive. I don't know if that happened to you too. What is your experience about that?
Yeah, I've lived in the Midwest of the US my entire life. So I've been landlocked. I saw the ocean for the first time when I was 18 years old. It took that long to get to the ocean. And I think I caught the bug. And ever since then, it really has just been one of those things where I want to be reminded of it constantly, not only from wow, this is like an alien world. That's so cool that we can have a slice of the ocean in our living rooms or in our offices or whatever, but also as a constant reminder that it needs our help, and the ocean needs our attention, and the reefs need our attention. And I know that people may be like, oh, why would you take coral from the ocean if it needs attention? A lot of this coral has been in the hobby for a long time. And when I say that, I mean, when I say the word aquaculture, I mean, this might be a piece that was brought in 20, 30 years ago from the ocean, but has proliferated in the hobby and has been fragged and fragged and fragged, and has done really well in home aquariums. So we're not necessarily taking as much from the ocean, and there are regulations, there are, you know, CITES and all those things that you have to fulfill. But I would kind of liken it, not totally, but when you're thinking of a soybean field or a corn field or something like that, a lot of the villages and the people around reef areas harvest the fish and the coral, and that's how they make money to sustain life in those areas. And it's very ornamental for us, but for them it's a way of life. So I think the connection that I feel and the connection that you feel are probably going to be different, and I think that that's really cool and unique. And you just gotta do it because you love it, and because it brings about curiosity. And I think that that's what science is, right? Science is all about trying to figure out new ways to do things, or being curious about new organisms. I'll never forget the first time that I spawned, like I bred my clownfish. They started to spawn on their own, laying eggs and all of that every couple of weeks. And I was like, instead of them eating their fry every single time they hatch, because that happens, I'm going to try and rear them, and I'm going to try and raise them up from eggs. And one of the first organisms that these fry feed on are called rotifers, and they're very tiny organisms, super, super tiny. But I'll never forget the first time that I saw thousands and thousands and thousands of these in a glass jar, and just being like, wow, this form of life is going to carry on these baby fry into adulthood. You know, there's the food chain that we always hear about, and it doesn't really make sense until you see some of the smallest organisms on that food chain. And now I've got my two clownfish, Uno and Dos, that I raised up from eggs, and we're, you know, fed rotifers in those first couple weeks of their life. So like I said, everybody's going to have a different connection, a different enthusiasm, and there's so many different niches within the coral, the reef keeping hobby. So
I like that. I find it very interesting. We're down here in South Florida, so we're very close to the ocean. We have that connection. We can go see that. For a lot of people that are inland or don't have the opportunity, it's hard for them to almost get into that, or find a love for the ocean without actually being in the ocean. So I think tanks do help people develop that connection, or help them get to that point where they can want to do that themselves, or they want to go and start their own reef tank. I feel like that's very important for people, not just here in South Florida. We have the opportunity to do more conservation type stuff, but like you said, coral, it stays in the industry. If someone has it down here in South Florida, you can take it far inland. You can take it to places where people don't exactly have access to the ocean, and provide them a place to learn, to see corals, to grow that development with them. And I think that's very important too. Do you have any experience on people, you know, becoming engulfed with coral by just visiting your tank, or visiting an aquarium, you know, putting people into the industry through association with tanks?
Yeah, there's so much of that happens. I mean, I'm kind of one of those stories, in that I lived my entire life in broadcast radio. You know, my what I studied in college was mass communications. So I went and I did a broadcast emphasis, and I've always been interested in science, and I was going into college to be a science teacher, but ended up taking the mass comm route. So it's always been something in the back of my mind. And as terrestrial radio has kind of died out over the years, I ended up losing my job in January of this year, and just kind of transitioned right into reef builders, which is, you know, something that formed as a fascination of the ocean and keeping these creatures in our homes into a full-time career. And that could spawn off of anything. You had mentioned conservation. I feel like Florida and the Caribbean is so key in all of the conservation efforts that not only happen in that area, but around the world. Everybody's looking to Florida, and everybody's looking to the Florida Aquarium and Carrie O'Neill and all those big names in the conservation space to figure out a way to save all of these beautiful creatures in our oceans. And one of the things is most of the Caribbean species are protected, so you're not going to see a lot of those species in private homes. We get recordias and rock flower anemones, and a lot of the inverts and things like that come into the hobby from the Caribbean, but most of the hard coral is all protected, and you cannot take that at all. So a lot of the coral from the industry or from the hobby is coming from Indo-Pacific, Australia, those kinds of areas where the coral is abundant. In a lot of places. I mean, obviously there's parts of the reef that are hurting still, but I think this could easily transition. The hobby could easily transition into a marine biology career. It could even zoology or anything. I think if you have a love for animals, it's just innate, right? It's probably going to happen. Like all of you guys are probably going to end up somewhere in, the taking care of animals or the learning about animals on a deeper level than most people would venture into.
Oh yeah.
Mm. And it is interesting that you mentioned your career as a mass communicator, because actually with your YouTube channel, I think you are also still doing some sort of mass communication of your passion, which is reef keeping, which is super interesting. Some years ago, well, I'm not an expert in this field, in the reef tank, but it was harder to find easily information, YouTube videos or Instagram. Now, like all social media, it's showing to more people and getting farther and waking it up, like that a small thing in the back of the head of kids and in general teenagers, that they can be also part of science. So I think that's also very important. What do you think about your YouTube experience as a mass communicator?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, and I've always kind of likened my role in this hobby as kind of the liaison between the everyday hobbyist and the science portion of this. Obviously, we've got, people like Salem Clemens on our team who, he studied bacterial microbiomes and all of the hard science aspects of coral reef keeping. Whereas I went to school for mass communications, but I've always had a love for science and I've always wanted to be in it in some way, shape, or form. My minor was anthropology. So that's kind of biological anthropology was kind of how I filled that void. While it is the study of humans and not the study of animals, it was still, there's a lot of things that happen in the scientific process that can get you to where you want to go, if that makes sense. So I always, some of my heroes are like Bill Nye the Science Guy, who had the science background but could also communicate effectively with people and translate that message from hard science to the layperson who's just wanting to keep a reef in their house because it looks pretty. You know what I mean? What are some deeper aspects of that we can explore that aren't going to get you to be what's the word I'm looking for? That's not too overwhelming, if that makes sense, but you still understand it on a deeper level. So that's kind of how I see my role and how I kind of fit those two things together.
Mm-hmm.
Piggybacking off what you said about.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that. Go ahead, Ryan.
Huh. Well, I was just going to ask a follow-up question.
Yes.
Right,
now I will intervene, Garcy. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I wanted to piggyback off you talking about communication being such an important factor in the industry. And I know that social media platform is very important in sharing content and networking with others. So I wanted to know if you thought that social media content should be more educational based or visually, aesthetically pleasing to capture people's eyes. And yeah.
I think that's a good question too. I think the aesthetically pleasing stuff, the Instagram tanks, the fluorescent corals and all of that is what draws a lot of people in and gets their attention, right? We need to be able to maintain that attention, and we need to be able to maintain that attention on a deeper level, because that does get people into the hobby. But there are a lot of obstacles that come with, the first reef tank that draw people out of the hobby as well very, very quickly. So I think to answer your question, we need a mix of both. But I would advocate for a deeper understanding. This isn't, no offense to like owning guinea pigs, but this is a little bit more complex than owning a guinea pig, or even, you know, a betta in a freshwater tank. And I don't want to put those down, but we're talking about taking an average person, and now they're a plumber, and they're an electrician, and they're a chemist, and they're a biologist, and they have to understand how all of these systems kind of work together, at least loosely understand that. So I think that it's good to get people into the hobby because of the fluorescent stuff, but we need to be able to teach them, you know, how to take care of all of those animals, because they may look pretty, but they also need a care regimen as well.
No, I completely agree.
Yeah, and
Yeah, I think
it's
it's really.
go ahead,
Go.
Brian. Sorry.
This wouldn't happen if we were in person.
I know the delays getting to us. Yeah, I find it very interesting that new people to the hobby are more attracted. Not, I wouldn't say more attracted, but the visuals kind of get them in, and then a lot of people get discouraged from that hard work, or that first algae bloom that they got to do a lot of maintenance on. And so I think it's a good point to know that it's not just about the aesthetically pleasing, but also, yeah, you have to look at what you want and how you can maintain your tank for the best possible scenario for them to survive.
Yeah, and these aren't just non-living organisms. This is a live ecosystem you're taking care of, with live organisms that are relying on you to stay alive. So I completely agree with you, Ryan.
So following the same line, what are the challenges that someone has to overcome while learning to maintain the tanks? Because you mentioned before, you need a lot of time, you need some kind of knowledge in about a little bit of everything, plumbing, lighting, etc. But it is not only the time, it is a lot of things to learn, it is a lot of things to take into account that can be challenging and sometimes discouraging if something doesn't go as planned. So what would you recommend for the people to continue to pursue the reef tank keeping?
I think for the most part, and this should be encouraging to new hobbyists, but I think for the most part, all of the common nuisance things that happen in a reef tank are documented and can be solved to some extent. The biggest that I can think of in the first year, you're going to get some pretty ugly nuisance algae if you do not have herbivores in your tank, like tangs. And this happens a lot in the smaller tanks. So, you know, you shouldn't be keeping a tang in a tank that's too small to, you know, for that fish to be healthy and survive and things like that. But once you get into those bigger tanks, it's nice because you've got your own little cleanup crew in there that isn't a snail, that isn't a hermit crab, that will just constantly be grazing on your rock work to make sure that it's clean and, you know, free of that nuisance algae. Because while we think of nuisance algae as being a nuisance, it's very natural in the reef environment. Like if you were to go into the ocean, you would see algae everywhere. It's just part of it. So it's just, from our standpoint as hobbyists, it's just, you know, aesthetically not as pleasing. There's things like flatworms, which are a very common pest that you would see in the first couple years, and even beyond. You know, people have issues with acro-eating flatworms, and, you know, red planaria, those kinds of things that pop up, and they don't really, the red planaria, the rust colored flatworms don't do a whole lot of damage, but they're not super.
You're giving me nightmares.
Yeah, exactly. But they just kind of lay on corals, and they can take over, and they can proliferate very, very, very quickly, because we do have our little subsection of the reef, but we also don't have all of the predators that would normally be feeding on these animals. The circle of life isn't necessarily complete in the aquarium, right? So you have to take some action by manual removal, or getting a wrasse or something that would take care of those flatworms. I'm a huge advocate on natural predators. So finding the copperband butterfly to take care of the aptasia, or a peppermint shrimp to take care of aptasia. That's another pest that people can get overwhelmed by. It's an anemone, and again, naturally occurring in the reef, but can end up stinging and suffocating corals, so that the pretty stuff that you like to look at is now getting stung by a nuisance or a pest, as we call it in the hobby. But there are Bergia nudibranchs. There are things that eat other things, and if you can find that, you can basically hire a work crew that isn't a chemical, and it isn't something you pour into your tank, to basically feed off of those things until they're gone or eradicated. So there's so many different things that you will encounter, but I think that it never ends. So even for me, I've been in the hobby, off and on for the last 15, 20 years. And, I'm dealing with cyanobacteria in my Red Sea 165. That's a thing that can be solved by, proper water chemistry and a lot of flow. I'm now finding all those spots where the flow isn't what I would like it to be. So I'm going to have to add some power heads and some wave makers in those strategic areas to make sure that rock stays clear, because that can take over. So there's a lot of problems, but there's also a lot of solutions. So if you're a problem solver, this is definitely the hobby to get into.
Right. And that's something that is becoming very, very valuable for them. We are trying to build our systems from the bottom. We could certainly add from day one, if the tank was cycle or using cycle rock, corals and fish. But the idea you mentioned, the microbiome, is something that they are learning. They actually are literally seeing how the tank changes if we start dosing regularly certain strains of bacteria, how they had issues cleaning the glass every single day, and we started dosing bacteria, and now the water is crystal clear. How useful is a UV sterilizer? We also try to use as many natural resources as we can. One thing that you mentioned, for example, with aptasia, that many of the natural solutions that we try to use, like peppermint shrimp, sometimes they are going to be smaller than the aptasia and they will become the food. Sometimes the aptasia is just too big and they don't touch it. Sometimes they will find the psoas more interesting. Copper band. That with copper band, and this is something that I'm trying to teach to them, because in the same way that we aquaculture corals, we should try to, or strive to, get as many aquaculture fish as we can. Thankfully, the University of Florida closed the reproductive cycle in copper band, so at some point we may get them in captivity. But at the same time, they are learning that when you get a wild animal, because we have a magnificent fox face, and he's scared. He has places to hide. He has algae to graze. It's the biggest fish in the system. It's a big system, but nonetheless, the animal is scared. Who knows the reason? So that's something that, number one, is building the natural system as much as we can and counting with those organisms that we cannot see. It's something that they are learning, that is more than just adding snails, hermit crabs. Just a few days ago, we added our first hermit crabs. We've been being able to not having any algal bloom without any of them, just with bacteria. We don't do water changes. We just have done a few of them. So we try to maintain that. My goal is that they understand that this is a portion of the reef, and this is how it should be from the bottom to the top of the trophic web. And I think that Garcy actually wanted to mention one of our new issues that they learn, and I asked them please not to touch them. Go ahead, Garcy.
Yes, we started dealing with some bubble algae in the 30-gallon tank, and we're going over the proper procedure on how to remove them, because if you don't remove them properly, you can release apparently hundreds of spores or whatnot into the water. So I find it very interesting that, even though we went through these quarantine processes and protocols to make sure that you don't find these hitchhikers, you can still find things like bristle worms and fireworms still in the tank.
Yep.
It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, that's one of those things that no matter how hard you try to have a sterile system as far as pests go, they, as Jeff Goldblum's character in Jurassic Park says, life finds a way, right? So it's gonna get in there, and you're gonna have to deal with it. And I don't care what anybody says, you're gonna find it. And bristle worms, as long as they're not too abundant, they're actually a solid member of the detritivore community. They'll help get that stuff up off the floor of the tank, and make sure that that's managed well from a microfauna level at least. And you had said bubble algae. There's some controversy on that, and I think you'll find a lot of this too. You'll see in the hobby, especially, you'll see someone say, well, don't pop the bubbles on the Valonia because spores will be released into the water, and you'll or the problem will proliferate. But then there's other people that are like, it doesn't matter, so where's the data? And that's what we always ask. Where's the data for this? Where's the study for this? Do we know for a fact that this is a thing? And I think where you guys come in, where the young students come in, let's set up an experiment and let's find the answers. That's where the youth of America in this hobby are going to come into play, are answering questions that are just anecdotal in the hobby, like the bubble algae stuff. So I think that's where you guys should feel empowered to run some of these experiments. Salem just graduated from college, and we're running an experiment, a community science experiment right now, to see if different carbon sources, whether that be vodka or sugar or Nopox, things like that you're feeding bacteria, are we getting the right bacteria, or are we feeding the bad guys too? And those are things that we can measure now. So if you have questions like that and it hasn't been answered, I think it's up to you guys to figure that out.
So it's funny to hear that, because you are leading us to something that Ryan has been working over the summer and that we are going to continue working on. And Ryan, you can explain what's your experiment.
Yeah, so basically, I'm trying to understand the results of ammonia test kits and see specifically which ones are more accurate than others with known concentrations of ammonia. So everyone knows testing kits are a very important part of reefing. You need to know the values. You need to understand what's wrong with your tank, what your parameters are set at. And some test kits are more inaccurate than others. Some have different readings. There's a gray area between the two, the values. So like API, it's a colored system. Some people might not see the colors as well or be able to tell exactly the right parameter. So my project is understanding which tests are more accurate and which can detect those minute differences better. And then piggybacking on that, additionally with ammonia, that comes with your nitrite levels, that comes with your nitrate levels, that affects your pH, your alkalinity. So measuring all those variables at once and assessing how they measure and play with each other is important for reefing and understanding the maintenance of your tank and how to best evaluate that.
I definitely applaud you for doing that. That's awesome. I think another factor I would throw in is proper methodology when it comes to testing, because you have to take into consideration that you're I don't know, your 25-year-old out there, or even like your 65-year-old who's starting up their first reef tank and has never done a titration test before, or a HANA test before. Do they know how to properly measure the water that's going? Do they know what 10 milliliters looks like? Those kinds of things. I think making sure that there's also a proper methodology that is followed with each one of those tests is also something to consider. I'm not like trying to, add complexity to your experiment. That's already awesome. So keep going with what you're doing. But that's one thing that I think that a lot of these studies don't take into consideration is my mother testing water. This is just like a foreign thought to a lot of people. So methodology is definitely something to consider as well.
That's also on his experimental design methodology. So basically, they have been seen during the summer. We have HANA testers, but I've been torturing them, forcing them to use API. I don't see. I mean, HANA requires more time. Supposedly, it's more accurate. We have been seeing different readings using them for the same parameter. The same thing with the SECAM, the ammonia batch. The SECAM ammonia batch doesn't give you an ammonia reading when your API or your Salifer is giving you a different result. And I've been seeing, they have been reading the difference between, for example, the drop bottle, putting it straight on an angle, that your 5 milliliters have to have a certain concave shape to have the actual 5 milliliters. So that is part of his experimental design, which is not only, I think it's going to contribute to the hobby to understand that maybe you don't need to invest at the beginning hundreds of dollars on HANA tester, and you can use the others because the difference is not that big. You just need to improve your accuracy, but also it's going to make him a future better researcher because he's starting to think in a way that previously that was not there. And you can see that change, and that's thanks to the reefing.
That's great. I love that. That's all awesome that you're doing that. I just put live rock in a tank that I got a bunch of live rock direct from the Solomon Islands. And so I've been observing it for the last couple of days, and there was some sort of invertebrate that was I want to say it was some sort of anemone or something that didn't make it on the live rock in. And I noticed last night thousands of copepods just devouring this thing. And I've never seen copepods move this quickly. So my first instinct is to remove a couple and put them under a microscope and see what kind they are so that I can find out if they're parasitic or not, so that before I put fish or any kind of other life in there, they're okay. Right. So I love that once you start to think like a scientist, and once you start to think in those ways, you can do so much. You mentioned the badges, how many hobbyists put those in their tank thinking that that's the only thing they need to do. Right. Once that changes colors, I've got ammonia. Well, I feel like it's probably too late at that point. So you should also be doing the titration tests as you were talking about, but I can't wait to see what you find in that, because that'll be interesting for sure.
Yeah. And like you were saying also with methodology, there's a lot bubbles in your test kit, different size drops. There's a lot of factors that go into reading a test kit. So it's not, like you said, it's not only about the accuracy of the test kit itself, it's about the methodology of, like you said, going through that accurately and to the T, doing the instructions correctly.
Yeah. So I think that Garcy on her side, she's been working more on the communication part. So she's been my guinea pig we've been doing YouTube videos that instead of being me talking, why not taking an advantage of that and teaching a student how to communicate and how to speak. So we are going to be releasing YouTube videos just for students or for future interns. But she's been learning a lot in that area, and also learning more about corals. Like, for example, the moment when she realized that corals and jellyfish were the same thing. And that's something that for them, I understand, it blows their mind. It's like, yes, a jellyfish upside down inside an external calcareous skeleton. So yeah, but we have also experienced a few drawbacks along the way, especially during quarantine. I think that we all know, because you mentioned previously how it's important to have that aesthetically pleasing portion on social media. We all mentioned that. But sometimes it will lead someone that can afford it to buy something like a Grandmaster's Colimia or a Holy Grail torch. And maybe you don't have the knowledge or the tank or the means to maintain that animal. And a Holy Grail torch is an animal that in most cases have been aquaculture, but your Scully, that's not been aquaculture. So they have been growing attached emotionally to the tanks, to our systems, to the animals. I think that that's something that you could go over, because especially during QT, because we did QT everything, there are things that you lose and you see them suffer, and you don't want that to happen, especially when they are from the wild. So what I think that Garcy, for example, has names for our fish, which I discovered recently. Garcy?
Oh yeah.
Can you please repeat that, Professor? You cut off. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
That I believe that you have names for our fish, right?
Yes, in our 30-gallon, we have the female, the more aggressive clownfish. Her name is Grumpy. She's, as her name indicates, she's a bit grumpy. She'll chase after any item you put in the tank around in her corner. And then we have Silly, which is the smaller male clownfish, and I call him Silly because he's just very silly acting. He hosts 3 anemones actually, and won't even let Grumpy get near the other anemones. And yeah, you really do gain an attachment to these creatures, especially like taking care of them and like seeing that they are literally relying on you to survive. So yeah, it's a very interpersonal relationship for sure that you gain over time. And yeah, you do learn a lot. So it is interesting. I wanted to ask something. You know, we've learned a lot over the couple months that we've been taking care of these tanks. I wanted to know what are the biggest things, Remy, that you have taken out of being in the industry for 10, 15 years that maybe could help us in the future?
Yeah, from a hobbyist standpoint, because the industry is a whole nother ball game.
Yep.
It could be very sad and very dramatic at times. So I would suggest that as long as you can stay outside of that would be good. I know it has been mentioned about aquaculture. I think one of the biggest things that I wish that I would have known earlier is aquaculture corals and fish do better in captivity. There's no way around that. So if you know that you're going to your local fish store, a question that you can ask is, where did this come from? Where did this coral come from? Where did you get it from? Is it coming in on an Indonesian, shipment? Is it coming in from Australia? If it is, was it held there for a while as this coral proliferated in the hobby before? Because that's going to increase your chances of keeping it alive, especially if you're a beginner. There's another form of coral that comes in called maricultured. And a lot of these corals are basically put out on racks in the ocean. And a lot of acropora, a lot of torch are basically kept on these like outcroppings. Different outfits have various locations that they would keep these, and they just keep them on racks, like frag racks, but they're in the ocean. And it's harder for these to sustain life after they've been removed from that situation. So what you'll see a lot in the hobby is you'll see these acropora come in, and they look just beautiful when they come in. Millipora, acropora, they're pinks and oranges and greens and blues and just beautiful colors. But they're expressing all of that because they were just in their home, like they were in the ocean. They have not been proven in the hobby yet. So what a lot of times people will buy those at a cheaper price, and they'll put them in their tank, and they'll end up bleaching within a couple weeks because they're just not used to that. So my advice would always be to ask for, a lot of the name corals, a lot of like the bird's nest, Milka stylos. I'm thinking of a lot of the Euphilia that has been grown in the hobby for a long time. Those are going to be your more hardy species to keep. And I think when you're a beginner, that's all you want, is you want to make sure that you can have some early successes. And that's a question that you can ask local fish store, vendor, whatever. They'll be able to tell you how long they've had it. And a lot of times the vendors, especially because we were just at Reef Stock a couple weeks ago, and they'll be like, I've been growing this for 3 or 4 years. I've been growing this for 5 years or a year or whatever. And those are the corals that you would want to purchase, especially if you're going to lay down a lot of money on them, because, you know, they can get a little expensive.
Yeah, further on that topic of sustainability, I know it's uncommon for people to, I wouldn't say uncommon. Harvesting wild corals is almost looked down upon. We already have an effect on the environment. We don't want to further cause detriment to that by removing other corals from their natural habitats. But yet people still do want those corals. So what is the goal of raising them, like you said, aquaculture or mariculture, and then releasing them to people rather than a source where they go straight to the environment and remove natural corals? How can we more focus towards just supporting people that grow corals themselves, farm it, and then also can supply them to the aquarium industry without depleting or affecting our natural ecosystem in the wild? I feel like that's a very important topic to discuss, where we want to make sure not to have an environmental impact, or the least we can, while also showing off corals and providing a place for people to come look at corals and buy them.
Yeah, there's a common phrase that's used in the hobby that I've noticed over the past couple of years, and that's, you know, wild harvested corals are less than 1% of all corals in existence, or something along those lines. Now, I don't know if that is true. I don't know if that's a marketing thing. Yeah, I don't know if that's, you know, to make you feel better about wild harvested corals. But you can do that. Only you can make the decision to know that you're supporting. And there's a lot of farms out there that are farms. They'll bring in the coral, but then they'll hold on to it for a couple of years before they release it to the hobbyist. Those are the places that I would suggest supporting, if that's how you feel. Like if you truly want to make this a more sustainable hobby, and those are your viewpoints, then find out who is farming coral for the majority of what they bring in. Like, I don't know, I go to Than from Tidal Gardens, who has a massive coral farm. He never really brings in new stuff. He just relies on all of the stuff that's been in his care for 10 plus years. Those are the kinds of guys that you probably want to do business with. You might pay a little more for the coral frag, but you know that's, you know, it's aquacultured and it's been in the hobby for a long time. So I think every hobbyist has the ability to make that choice. And, you know, if enough of us make that choice over time, then yeah, we can make a difference, but it's going to take a little bit of time to do that.
That's also something that I'm trying. Sorry, Ryan. That's just that I noticed that lately is becoming more. You know that when you're in a certain time in the hobby, you already know people. You go to frag swaps. You stop getting corals that have been wild harvested, because you are getting more from people that are already in there, and you even have your backup in other tanks just in case. But I've noticed that there is a lot of people, like for example, battle corals, small farms, not as big as Top Shelf or World Wild or even Tidal Gardens, that they grow corals in their home for many, many years. I mean, obviously, Jason Fox is not a small farm. It's not a huge one. It's a very big name. But you can be sure that by supporting this in the same way that you will go to farmers market, you are more likely to get a coral that has been in captivity for a number of years. And also you're getting an animal that is more likely to survive, which in the end is something that we need to remember. In the same way that we get sad when we lose our fish, when a colony dies, you are losing a lot of animals in a single event. So I think that supporting local farms, even if it's in the entire United States, obviously, that are doing that at a small scale, increases the likelihood of you getting something that is local, because that person has lower chances of going to Indonesia and importing mariculture corals and then growing them to sell them, because the effort doesn't pay for the investment.
Yeah. I think the obvious reasoning for harvesting wild is money, right? The person who is harvesting the coral that has never been seen in the hobby, or has and is hard to keep alive in the hobby, if they can, that coral can fetch a very healthy price. I mean, anybody who has been in the hobby for a while knows that there's some crazy zoanthids, there's some crazy acropora out there. And, you know, you're paying upwards of $1,500 for something the size of your pinky. That's why people are going out there and trying to find the new, latest, greatest thing that no one's ever seen before. And unfortunately, I think that, you know, the money issue is a human nature thing. It's a part of the world that we live in right now, but you don't have to participate in that if you do not wish to. And I empower everybody that is hearing this to take that and put that in their tool belt, because you don't have to do that. You don't have to participate in that.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have a great point in how it is important to select the correct source of the corals, as you mentioned. But I also wanted to touch another important topic, which is the environmental impact that the maintaining of the tanks and reef keeping has too. There is, of course, always like people that will say that there is no real impact, and there will people that say that it actually causes an impact because it has like a ton of water usage, you use electricity, there is pumps operation, so you have still a footprint like any other activity. It's not that I'm saying like reef keeping is impacting, but I'm just giving examples of what are the things to be considered in the impact of the hobby, and how do you think that the way you do it can be sustainable?
Yeah, that's an interesting point that is never talked about in this hobby, and I am ignorant to it. But you make a good point with, you know, you think about the cardboard box that your salt comes in, the plastic bag that your salt comes in. These are all things that are not good for the environment. You know, the non-biodegradable things that are used in the hobby when it comes to additives and all of that kind of stuff. It just, the water used. I think if, you know, on a very small level, if you're making your own RODI water, getting an RODI machine that has a lower ratio of clean water to wastewater, or if you're harvesting the wastewater that's coming out of there as well and using that for, you know, plants or other things that, you know, the water that doesn't need to be totally clean can use. Those are the little things that you can do, and always, you know, be recycling cardboard and things like that. This is a huge issue. This is a much bigger issue. And it sounds like you know a little bit more about this than I do, but that is something that people need to think about too. Like the footprint that we use with electricity. I mean, it's a very electric demanding hobby. Everything runs on electricity. So, you know, how can we do that? I know a lot of guys who have set up solar panels just specifically for their reef tank.
That's a great idea. Mm-hmm.
And you can, and it won't power it 24/7, but you can power it for as long as you have enough sun during the day. And this can also help when it comes to a power outage or things like that, where you've got to have a backup system, and whether that's battery powered or a generator or whatever. If you've got solar panels hooked up, that should help in some way, shape, or form. Again, I'm ignorant to this because this is not a practice that I have gotten into yet. But I think that thinking of things like that can really help lessen that carbon footprint.
I think it's very interesting.
Go ahead, Giulliana.
No, go ahead.
Continue.
Oh, I was going to say that it's very interesting that you mentioned actually trying to reduce the discharge of the wastewater or reusing it. I think that's something that could be implemented and definitely will help to reduce the impact.
There is another aspect in that whole sustainability idea, and how much the hobby can cost or impact the environment, which is the feeding. We feed heavily or lightly. I think that we should be feeding heavily, just for the health of our system, as long as the system is able to handle it. But we are feeding with marine protein. And probably we are all aware of the issue with overfishing. So some of those organisms can be aquaculture, but many of them are not. Actually, one of our future hosts is coming from Easy Reef. I think they're doing a great job producing very high quality food, mostly relying on phytoplankton. But we are seeing other companies that are also starting to sell their own phytoplankton, and I think that probably all will know that I'm making reference to Top Surf Aquatics, where they have started to grow their own strains, not their own strains, common strains that have been in science for many years, but they are very easy to maintain, and the turnover of that crop is very efficient. Another thing is that, and this is a project that we have for the future, because our department also have an entomology section. It's mostly entomology, to be honest. So this is something that is being done in salmon farming as an initiative, because salmon in captivity is being fed with fish that is coming from the ocean. And we have the same question: why are we not eating that fish instead of feeding that to salmon? So there is this company in I think that is in Maine, that is using black fly soldier larvae, which basically grows out of waste. You can get a huge yield using waste and feed that protein to the salmon. And the project is trying to do the same thing with our reef fish. Obviously, you are not going to be able to feed the whole larvae, but you can transform the larvae into pellets. That is very rich in protein. It's very low production. You just need a bin and garbage. That's basically how you're going to get it. And I think that the hobby at some point will move into that direction. That is starting to do it, with relying more into phyto, into using copy pods as a source of live food, even when we, for in some reasons, sometimes we don't need them as live food anymore, because things like your dragonet or your mandarin fish is coming captive bred from biota. Thank you for that. Because so I think that that's another point, is the feeding. And there are alternative ways of feeding our tanks.
Yeah. I would challenge anybody listening to this to, I think that would be a fantastic experiment, is to measure the carbon footprint of the average reef tank, and, take the tanks that you guys are using there and calculating those. I wouldn't know where to start with measuring that, but I think that would be a very huge eye opener for a lot of people in the hobby, to be like, okay, we're trying to conserve and we're trying to be nice to the environment and sustainable and all these things, but how much is it to captively breed these fish? How much does that affect the environment over just grabbing it? That's an argument. If I'm getting a wild fish as opposed to a captive bred fish, what's the impact on the environment by doing that? Is it far less if taking from the ocean? Is it far less with captive bred? I have 4 tanks in my room right now. What negative effects am I having on the environment from that perspective? I think that would be a fantastic experiment, and something that we definitely need an answer to.
And extremely complex to design, and probably to obtain a conclusion, because there are things that are not going to be that easy to measure, like genetic diversity. How are you affecting the population? Some tank populations are really high in numbers. The problem is not the single tank that we have. The problem is the mortality along the way. The problem is losing genetic diversity. How do you assess that? So we know that things like, for example, the Banggai cardinal fish, most of them nowadays come from captive bred sources. Thank God once again, because before that it was cyanide. So yes, you are leaving an impact behind by growing them in captivity, but you are not causing that genetic loss, which I don't know how you will measure that.
Yeah.
But it's a good idea. I probably, if I had to do it, I will start with setting a tank from zero and see how many things, like the carbon print is immense. The problem is that I don't think that any big company will sponsor that experiment.
No.
So we will lose. I'm not going to give any names because there are some cases in which you get connectors for every nation. It's like, I'm in the USA. Why don't you give me just the plug that I need for here and not for it? Because it hurts to get rid of all that. Yep.
Goes back to money.
Obviously. That's why it is a hobby.
Yeah.
So, yep. So also, what do you guys think that you have gained during the summer in the sense of observation skills? What can you tell from when you started looking at a tank, and what can you see now when you look at a tank? Do you see any change in that? Because I'm sure that Remy can tell that you become, if you don't have a obsessive disorder, you develop it. And you start being more attend not only to your time, but to things that you didn't see before. And I'm sure that you noticed it with the pass of these months.
Yeah, so for me specifically, yeah, it almost changes your way of thinking. You go from less of looking at it as oh wow, this looks pretty, to almost like a categorical. There's steps to it. When before I even look at the tank, it's like, okay, do I hear a noise? Is the pump on? Is this going? Is there a noise coming from here? Can I hear this? And then once you start looking at it, it's, oh, this is in the tank today that I didn't notice yesterday. This could be a problem. There's a lot of steps that you go through almost now that you actually learn. Now that I actually step back and learn, it's less of looking at it in awe and more of creating a mental structure of how to address everything. If I see something off, what do I do? What's the progression of events? If I do a water change, if I need to do something really quickly, how can I do that efficiently and in the right steps? I feel like it's helped me gain that an almost headspace type of mind where instead of just kind of skimming over things, I categorically go through things step by step and just double check, make sure everything is in order and everything is to the T.
That's another thing we talk about, like nuisance algae and pests and things, getting people out of the hobby. But the mental part of this also takes people out of the hobby. So if you're not a fan of all of those things that you just went through, coming down and hearing a different noise, or knowing when the RODI reservoir needs to be refilled, or hearing an alarm, or whatever the case may be, if you don't have that innately in you, then you're probably also going to get out just from the mental struggle that you will feel having a reef tank in your house,
or going to sleep thinking, what are you gonna do the next day to make your anemone be happier? Something like that. It's like, I'm going to sleep and my last thought is, tomorrow I should do this. That's always in the back of your mind.
Yep.
Over time, piggybacking on what Ryan said with checking the maintenance of things and checking things, making sure things are all right. I think over time as well too, that you start catching an eye of what the protein skimmer is supposed to sound like. If the UV lights are working, if the apex is working, if your internet's off, little things like that. I feel like you start to catch an eye, and you don't have to take so much time into doing the maintenance. Like in the beginning, when I first started taking care of the tanks, it would probably take me about around 3 hours to clean the tank, feed the fish, and make sure everything's working properly. But now over time, I'm taking around an hour and a half, 2 hours now, because I know how everything is supposed to look, how the fish are supposed to behave, what is considered strange. And I think that's just spending time with them over time and just being in that atmosphere with the tank. You you start catching up on things a lot quicker.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All about
I think it's
processing.
a very detail-oriented hobby. You need to be paying attention, as Garcia and Ryan already mentioned, to everything, like the sounds, the behavior of each individual that it's there. You kind of already know, like Garcia already told before, like which is the dominant clownfish comparatively to the other one. Like you already know exactly how are they going to behave and the changes, and you notice, or you are going to become able to notice if something's starting to go wrong. So those details are also important, other than the measuring, of course, all of the procedure of measuring and the pH and the temperature and everything, all the equipments are working, which equipments need cleaning or not. I think it's um, as I mentioned, it's very detail oriented, which is, at least for me, it brings me joy. But you said it's not for everybody.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I still have only 7 fish in my 165-gallon aquarium, because they're good right now. And I know that when I enter another fish or 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever, it changes the hierarchy of how they function. And I they're all just doing so well right now that I might just keep 7 fish in here forever. We'll see. But you're right. When you notice things, when you observe something every day, you can tell what's going to happen, how they're going to behave. And you're able to notice even the most minute little tiny microscopic things and changes in your tank, which I think is a cool thing to learn over time, for sure. You become quite a better problem solver in everyday life too. So
Yeah, I think that we have seen, you mentioned 7 fish. 7 fish might be enough. Why do you want a tank full of fish? It's Do you know that there is this metric of certain inches of fish per gallons or liters of water, which I think that they have learned that it doesn't make sense, because it's not the same thing, a convict tank or an Achilles, the clown or a dragonet, or no, they're not going to behave the same way. We have seen that, for example, Julian Sprang, his tanks are, well, probably have seen them. They are amazing. He doesn't have them filled with fish. They're full of coral, but he gives their fish just the space that they need, because the reality is that we are never gonna be able to give them the space that they truly need. Of course, you have things like a clown. The clown, once he hosts an anemone or the intake of your filter or whatever he chooses, he's not going to move. But then you have your tanks that they are used to swim all around the reef all day long. So that's another thing to consider, is that sometimes we want to collect, and I'm trying to help them learn that we are not collecting animals, that we are keeping them alive. When we take them from the store, we should do that with the certainty that we are going to be able to maintain them alive, because that's the least that we owe them.
Yeah.
At least that's the perspective that I have. That's how I think that this hobby is gonna be sustainable in the future.
Yeah. Whenever I think of adding fish, I think of fish that are utility players, like the tangs are going to graze on the nuisance algae, and you get wrasses that will pick on the flatworms and things like that. Like that would be the only reason at this point for me to add more fish. And it depends. I mean, you can have a fish only system, and that's where you can have your big angelfish and things like that, the emperor angels and the queen angels and all those these beautiful fish, right? That would wreak havoc on a reef tank. Or you can have a mixed reef and really showcase the corals instead. As you're coming into your first tank, I've just started a small fish list for my Solomon Islands biotope tank. Like, what are some of the cool utility players on the reef in the Solomon Islands that are native to the Solomon Islands? So that's my next project. But always go into whatever tank you're planning, or whatever tank is next, with a plan. Have a little bit of an idea of what you'd like to do with it. It'll always change. You might say that you want this specific coral and that's it. it'll change. It will, and that's okay. That's an okay thing to happen, but have a little bit of a guide as you're going in for sure.
And I'm curious, so for your documenting for your tank, how are you obtaining documentation about which the fish that we call utility are? So which fish from the Solomon Island are gonna be an utilitarian fish for you? Are you using scientific literature? Are you using, because the hobby is a great thing, sometimes is full of things that are wrong, and the problem or the trick is to tell when it's right and what. Obviously you can tell, well, this people has been in the hobby for 30 years, he should know what he's doing. Sometimes that's not the case. So where is the line in there between science and the hobby? If I really want to, or if they really wanted to be to recreate a biotope from the Solomon Islands in this case.
I think, like you said earlier, and I kind of look at fish and corals as different personalities and people that you know and family members that you know. Some people like mushrooms, other people don't like mushrooms, you know. So we may generalize and say that every copper band butterfly is going to feed on Aiptasia, but that's not always the case in captivity. They might not want to eat that, or peppermint shrimp, or you might have the wrong species of peppermint shrimp, you know, things like that. So for me, it's best guess on you know, given like the Talbot's damsel or any damsel is said to have or feed on flatworms, and you know they are carnivorous in that way, but you don't know if they're actually going to do that, but display that behavior or not. So I think for me, when I'm going into this new tank, I'm looking at, okay, what are the fish that live near the sand? What are the fish that will live in the water column and dart in and out? What are the fish that are, you know, more they like cave structures? They like to dive in every once in a while. I'm looking at the golden angelfish. It's a centropege genus, and it's a beautiful. It'd be a great like showpiece, I guess you could say. But
yeah.
You know, all those dwarf angelfish like to pick on soft corals, and that's you know, something that I would like to experiment with. I've always shied away from the flame angels and the coral beauties and things like that because they're reef safe with caution. But that's something that I would like to toy around with in this new tank and just see what happens. So there's no, I guess to answer your question, there's no specific answer. You know what I mean? You just kind of have to, you have to go with what maybe their diet is in the wild and hope that what you're purchasing them for, or what you're getting them for, a utility player in your tank, it actually happens. You know what I mean? But it's not guaranteed.
Yeah. So you mentioned the flame angel. We are actually gonna do the same thing that you just mentioned. It's funny because he likes to pick on things. So we have a flame angel fish, and that limits basically the tank to stonies. But we are gonna see, maybe if we put a frag, a SOA, or an AGAN. Let's see if he picks on them. If he picks on them, we'll take them out of the water, of there. But maybe he doesn't, because he's more curious than anything else. And there is a hierarchy in our tank. So he's not on top, even he's an angelfish, because we have a convict, and the convict is on top. And then it's the fox face. And so every fish is different, as you mentioned. Flames are sold as reef safe with caution, but you never know what you're going to get. Even the fox face could pick at a soft coral if they want to. You don't know if that is going to happen, and that's what their job is: observing that every day. And learning if your coral is close because the water is not right, the light is not right, the flow is wrong, or maybe someone is paying too much attention to them. Because this is the next part that they are going to learn, that is that you are not going to see the fish picking at the coral. You are not going to catch them.
Yeah. I think to kind of piggyback off the flame angel, there are several people in the hobby that are trying to breed them right now, and it's one of the I think one of the only in the centropege genus that is you can discern male and female just based on their look. That might be something that you guys toy around with in the future, is some sort of spawning program or breeding program with fish that have not been successfully bred yet. Or en masse, I guess I should say, because I will say that one of the most exciting things I have ever done in my life is taking a clownfish egg up to adulthood. I mean, the circle of life is complete once they start spawning. Once these two clownfish start spawning, the life cycle is complete. And I think that that's so cool that I was there to kind of usher that, have a hand in or a role in that. So I think if that's something you guys experiment with, whether it's clownfish or flame angels or whatever, I think you could get a lot of interest in that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And for your new ecosystem that you're preparing of corals in from the Solomon Islands, what would be your approach? Once you get a new species of fish that you're going to put there, what would be the procedure? You go through quarantine. How do you decide which fish goes first? I don't know what is, let's say, your normal scheme of order of ideas.
Yeah, I think it varies based on hobbyist to hobbyist. I've always had good luck in introducing fish, especially in a new system. And I haven't done the best at quarantine, but will be doing that on this one for sure. But introducing them all around the same time. So all the fish in my Red Sea and my 165 all kind of happen in a 2 or 3 week span. And that was it. So they get used to each other. They find their territory, they stake their claim, and that's it. There are other methods. I know that in the public aquarium sector, they have, I don't know if this is just the Denver Zoo that does this, but they call them howdy boxes. They're acclimation boxes so that the fish can say howdy to each other before they actually go in. And that's always a good tactic to use if you're going to introduce, especially more aggressive fish like your tangs and those more territorial fish. You mentioned the hierarchy that you guys have. The hierarchy in my Red Sea is the purple tang rules the tank, right? So she kind of is just the queen of the jungle in there and make sure everything is in line at all times. So if I were to add a new fish, I would probably stick them in an acclimation box so that everybody could see what's happening. They could see each other and then release them after a week or two when I feel like maybe they've had enough time to see each other. So that's my typical protocol for that. It's always worked for me for the most part. So I think I'm going to probably do the same thing on this next tank. Have the fish in quarantine ready to go, kind of put them all in around the same time and let them get acclimated and stake their claims in various parts of the tank.
Remy, I remember you talking about how you said one of the greatest accomplishments you've had as a hobbyist was raising a clown egg raising a clown egg to adult. What are some other accomplishments you would say that you've had over the years being a hobbyist?
I would say the weeping willow sarcophyton comes to mind. It's a coral that Jake Adams, one of the co-founders of Reef Builders, kind of made famous. And so it's been kind of a goal of mine to shed some light on corals that aren't necessarily looked at as we talked about the beginning of this with the fluorescing and all of those, because I feel like corals from all shapes and sizes, and it sounds funny that we all have value, right? We all have beauty in our own ways. But I think once you get beyond the the torch sector and all of that, which there's still awesome corals, you start to discover different kinds of corals. And I think that that's probably another, I wouldn't say it's an accomplishment, but it's something that I've finally crossed that bridge to where, I think a Moslea coral is cool. And it was a cool find for me. They're a Western Australian coral that kind of grow like a micromusa, or acan, as you might say, but they're a little bit more flat, and they're few and far between. You don't really see these a lot in the wild. So I saw one in a store, and I was like, I want that in my tank. And it's like a drab green color. It's not super fluorescent, but it's a cool growth pattern. And you'll start to, once you get past those first couple of years, you'll start to go, oh, gorgonians are cool. Man, these things or this random soft coral is cool. So to bring it back to the weeping willow, it's a toadstool, but it has super long polyp stalks on it that kind of like sway and sweep in the aquarium, which is really mesmerizing. And it became a very popular coral, and I feel like that's the one that I get messaged about the most. People are like, "Have you fragged it yet? I want a piece. Have you fragged it yet?" And it's like, no, I'm just letting them kind of go at this point. But I think appreciation for corals that you wouldn't typically see is an accomplishment in and of itself, because that's when you know that you've become a full-fledged coral nerd.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of our goals, one of our systems that is not built yet, but is projected. It's going to be created by Julian. It's going to be basically the type of biotope that you find in Florida. So our corals are not as colorful as the Indo-Pacific corals. Our fish, we don't have the same variety of tanks. We have 3-4 species of tanks. So our idea is create that tropical corridor where you go from the reef to the seagrass meadow to the mangrove, and having all together in a tight system where you're going to have your soft corals. Obviously, we cannot have stonies. And even if we had the permission, which for the husbandry probably we can get, for the nursery, for a display, it is not responsible to put them in there. But there is a lot of corals that when you go out diving here in South Florida, you see, or even sponges. So other components of the reef that are relevant, that, as you say, they are not fluorescent, they are still astonishing.
You'll appreciate photographing and shooting video on that tank too, because they don't necessarily need that blue light that is so hard to shoot video and things without an orange lens. Once you get that under that white light, it just looks so cool and so good.
So I think we don't want to take more of your time, unless any of you guys have a question or something to add. I think that has been
just one more question.
Yeah,
and
of course.
I just wanted to ask you, what do you think about the importance of reefing as a hobby to also promote coral reef conservation? In the sense that, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think where we can really make an impact is learning from a hobbyist level how to properly spawn and rear coral from a larva, from the coral larva. It's happening. There are several people in the hobby, and science, Richard Ross, Jamie Craggs, all these guys Carrie O'Neill, and they're in Florida, who have figured out how to spawn coral in captivity. And while I think the biosecurity is an issue, once it's in your tank, it's in your tank and it can't go back in the ocean, right? But if there is some way that some hobbyist is toying around with this one day and figures out the piece of the puzzle that we're missing, there's thousands of us that have aquariums in our home. And if we can capture any part of that experimentation, we can make a huge difference in the world of conservation. So, I think that's probably the next frontier. Just like how clownfish spawning was like a big deal back when it happened, and now it's not just orange and white anymore. For Ocellaris clownfish, you've got black and white and spotted and some blues out there now. But I think that when you put the power in the hobbyist hands, or you give them the cookie recipe, if you will, they might come up with some other different kind of way to put that together. And now all of a sudden we've figured out how to do this in mass, and we can put all of our heads together and help out the oceans in the end.
Yeah, hopefully. I said that we were going to end because that opened an entire different dialogue. Because it's not the same thing. You probably are familiar with this. It's not here. The Coral Finder.
Yeah, I have it.
So you're familiar with that. You're familiar with how we change the names all the time from Aiken to Micromusa. How do we classify taxonomically corals? It's not that easy as with a fish, which are, by the way, really difficult. But you have that they live in a symbiotic relation not only with the zooxanthellae but also with the bacteria and even with viruses, and you will find if you sequence them that they have genes from those other organisms. So where is the limit? And also if you spawn them in captivity, which we are doing with some of them, what is the role? When does the microbiome become an important part of the adult coral? And do you also need to keep an eye on your microbiome in that coral if that coral is to be released in the wild? If it's for the hobby, it's a different thing. There are many things that when you do the coral for restoration, you cannot do. Like, for example, if you are doing Caribbean corals and you want to clean the algae, you need to do it manually. If you have Aptasia, you cannot add a copper band. You cannot use anything that is not native. So in the same way, you can initiate some responses in corals using hormones, but you are not going to do that for restoration. But for the hobby, it is possible. You can use animal hormones, they will respond. Mm-hmm. You can use plant hormones, they will respond. The thing is that, to finish with that, is that on one side we have the restoration, on the other we have the business. And the business part is the part that should be investing into trying to spawn them in captivity for the hobby, because the protocol is not going to be the same as for restoration. Yeah. In restoration, we know that is patience, that is water quality, and that is light. For a production perspective, I think that if someone wanted to, we have the knowledge to spawn many of them. But that's, as I said, it's a different topic.
Yeah. I think we need to do a better job of science and industry speaking with each other and sharing information. I think that bridge needs to be gap needs to be bridged for sure.
And we are trying that. We are definitely trying that. When you speak with some coral scientists, they just don't want to hear about reefers. Some reefers or some old reefers in the industry don't want to hear about, and I'm saying industry, not in the hobby, don't want to hear about science. And it doesn't make sense, because there is one of the sector has a lot of theoretical knowledge and the other one has a lot of experience which should be applied. Mm-hmm. So it's like in any other field. If you are working in fisheries, you will listen to the fishermen because they are out there every single day, and you are out there like probably 1 month altogether. Mm-hmm. So as you said, that bridge needs to be broken, and I think that's some of these guys will do by starting from a hobby perspective and moving into the approach of science.
For sure.
So yeah, I think that it's been a great first podcast, breaking the ice for us. You've been a great guest. We really appreciate having you here with us. Because we are a small college, but this is a project in which we are all putting a lot of energy and enthusiasm. So thank you very much, Remy.
Thank you for having me, and I certainly appreciate you having me on before Julian sprung, because I don't know if I could go after Julian sprung.
That's why he's gonna be the last one.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
It's nice to see all of your smiling faces. It's nice to see some energy that's coming into the hobby and from a science perspective. So I urge you guys to try and answer the questions that we only have anecdotal evidence for. So
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you
thank
very
you
much
again.
for your time.
Thank
you got it.
Bye.
Bye.